The check was still warm from the printer when Denise ripped it in half. Marcus Hale watched the two pieces flutter down onto the granite counter of the kitchen that used to be his, landing next to a bowl of lemons he'd bought the week before everything fell apart. $5,140,000, split clean down the middle by a woman who used to fold his shirts. "I don't want your money," Denise said. "I want you to feel what I felt." Marcus didn't say anything. He'd learned, over 11 months of lawyers and silences, that the fastest way to lose an argument with Denise was to answer her immediately. So he stood there in his gray suit, in the kitchen with the marble island he'd picked out himself, and let the quiet stretch until it turned uncomfortable for her instead of him. "Say something," she said. "There's nothing to say. It's your copy. I'll have another one issued." "I don't want another one issued, Marcus. I want you to understand that you don't get to buy your way out of what you did." What he did. That phrase again. It had been the center of every conversation since the papers were filed. What he did, as if the marriage's collapse were a single act instead of 2 years of her coming home later and later, 2 years of hushed calls in the garage, 2 years of Marcus telling himself it was nothing, it was work, it was fine. Right up until the morning he found the hotel receipt in the pocket of her coat and understood it had never been fine at all. He'd never said any of that out loud. Not to her, not to the lawyers, not to his own mother. He didn't need to relitigate the marriage in a courtroom. He just needed it to end cleanly, and he'd been willing to overpay for clean. "Keep the check," he said. "Tape it back together if you want. It's still good." He turned to leave, and that was when the front door opened without a knock, the way it did when someone had a key and assumed they still belonged in a house they didn't own. "Denise? You said 7, it's already?" The man in the doorway stopped mid-sentence. He was maybe 50, silver at the temples, wearing the kind of navy suit that costs more than most people's cars, the kind Marcus recognized because he'd spent 15 years building a company that made men like this rich. Denise's face did something complicated. Surprise, then panic, then a scramble to arrange her expression into something normal. "Robert, this isn't a good time," she said. But Robert wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at Marcus, and something in his face had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man doing fast math. "You're Marcus Hale," Robert said. It wasn't a question. "That's right. Hale Instruments. The valve systems contract." Robert's hand came up, not for a handshake exactly, more like a reflex, an old habit surfacing before he decided whether to trust it. "You're the reason we didn't lose the Baton Rouge plant last spring." Marcus felt something shift in the room, though he couldn't yet name what. "I run procurement for Halden Cross Energy," Robert said. "Denise's boss." He paused, and something in his voice changed register entirely, dropped a full step into something closer to respect than a man usually offers a stranger in his girlfriend's kitchen. "Sir, I had no idea you were. I didn't put together that you were her ex-husband." "I'm sorry. I should go." Denise stood between them with the 2 halves of a $5 million check still lying on the counter, watching the only 2 men in her life who mattered look at each other like they'd just discovered they were standing on the same chessboard. 3 years earlier, Marcus Hale had been running Hale Instruments out of a leased warehouse in Beaumont with 9 employees and a line of credit he refused to talk about with Denise because talking about it made it feel more real than he could stand. He'd started the company after 14 years as an engineer for a competitor that laid him off 2 weeks before Christmas with a severance check and a smile. And he'd sworn that day he would never again build wealth for someone else's nameplate. Denise had believed in him then. That was the part that still surprised people who only knew the ending. She'd worked 2 jobs the first year, cut coupons, driven the same Honda for a decade past when it should have died, and never once complained when Marcus poured every spare dollar back into the company instead of into a nicer house or a nicer car. The turn came slowly, the way these things usually do. Hale Instruments landed a contract with a mid-size refinery outside Lake Charles, then another with a chemical plant in Port Arthur, and by year 4 Marcus was flying to Houston twice a month to sit across tables from men who controlled 9-figure budgets. He came home tired and preoccupied, and Denise, who had spent a decade being the engine of their survival, found herself suddenly with nothing urgent to do, and no one paying attention to whether she did it. She took a job in procurement at Halding Cross Energy, a firm Hale Instruments didn't do business with, which she said at the time was a deliberate choice. She didn't want anyone accusing her of trading on his name. Marcus had been proud of her for that. He told his mother about it on the phone, this small thing that felt, at the time, like evidence the marriage was healthy even as they drifted. He didn't find out about Robert Calloway until the marriage was already unsalvageable, and even then he found out by accident, the way people usually do. A hotel receipt for a room in Houston on a weekend Denise had told him she was visiting her sister in Tyler. He hadn't confronted her with the receipt. He'd simply started paying closer attention, and once he started paying attention, the evidence arranged itself with an efficiency that felt almost cruel, as though it had been waiting patiently for him to finally look. He never told anyone the affair was the reason for the divorce. He let people assume what they wanted, that success had changed him, that he'd grown distant, that two people who married young sometimes grow into strangers. He preferred that version. It cost him nothing, and it protected Denise from a version of the story that would have followed her. His mother had asked him once, over Sunday dinner a month before the papers were filed, whether he was sure about the divorce, whether there wasn't something worth fighting for. Marcus had looked at his plate for a long moment, and said only that some things end quietly, the way a light bulb goes out. No dramatic flicker, just darkness where there used to be a room. His mother hadn't pushed further. She'd raised him to keep his own counsel, and she recognized the shape of a door he wasn't going to open. His sister Renata had been less patient. She'd shown up at his old house one Saturday morning while he was packing boxes, and stood in the driveway with their arms crossed, demanding to know why he was letting Denise's version of events stand unchallenged at the mediation. "You're going to let people think you're the one who broke it," she said. "That's not pride, Marcus. That's just letting yourself get erased." He'd told her he'd rather be erased quietly than remembered loudly for the wrong reasons, and she'd left without agreeing, though she never brought it up again either. The settlement had been his idea, and it had been generous almost to the point of self-punishment. His lawyer, a sharp woman named Priya Ahuja, who had built half her practice on high-net-worth divorces, had pushed back hard. "You built that company before the marriage even stabilized," Priya said. "Texas is a community property state, sure. But the growth in the last 3 years came almost entirely from contracts you closed after she'd already checked out of the partnership. You don't owe her half of everything." "I know what I owe her," Marcus said, and didn't explain further, and Priya, who had seen enough marriages end to recognize a man protecting a version of events he didn't want spoken aloud, let it go. So the number landed where it landed, $5,140,000, structured as a lump sum specifically so there would be no ongoing entanglement, no monthly reminder, no reason for either of them to ever call the other again. Marcus had wanted an ending. He hadn't expected her to hand it back to him in pieces. Robert Calloway left that night without finishing whatever sentence he'd started in the doorway, and Denise didn't chase him down the driveway, which told Marcus more about the state of that relationship than she'd probably intended. Marcus drove home to the apartment he'd been renting since the separation. Clean, sparse, nothing on the walls yet, because he hadn't decided if this was temporary. And he didn't think about Robert Calloway again until Thursday, when his director of business development, A methodical man named Sam Okafor forwarded him an email with the subject line, Alvin Cross, RFP walked back. Hale Instruments had spent 4 months bidding on a valve replacement contract for Halding Cross Energy's Beaumont expansion, a deal worth just under $11 million over 3 years, the kind of contract that would let Marcus finally stop personally guaranteeing the company's line of credit. They'd been the leading bid. Sam's email said the procurement team had abruptly reopened the process to additional vendors, with 2 weeks' notice, no explanation given. Marcus read the email twice, then called Sam. Any idea why? Marcus asked. None. It came from Calloway's office directly. You know him? Marcus looked out his apartment window, at a parking lot he still wasn't used to. I met him once. Briefly. He didn't say anything more, and Sam, who had worked for Marcus for 6 years, and had learned to recognize when his boss was choosing his words with unusual care, didn't push. Marcus hung up and sat with it for a long moment. He wanted to believe it was coincidence. Procurement teams reopened bids for 100 boring reasons: budget cycles, new compliance requirements, a board member with a cousin who sold vows. But he built a company for 15 years by trusting his instincts about which coincidences were, and this one had a shade to it he didn't like. He thought about calling Denise. He decided against it. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't a conversation he wanted to have with her voice in it, softening things, complicating things, making him doubt what he already half knew. Instead, he called Priya. I'm not your divorce lawyer for this, she said when he explained it. I know. I need advice, not representation. If a client's ex-boyfriend, who happens to control procurement at a company I'm bidding with, decides to sabotage the bid because he's embarrassed about how we met, is there anything I can do about that? Legally? Priya was quiet for a second. Probably not directly, not unless you can prove retaliatory motive, and good luck proving what's in a man's head. But Marcus, if he's letting a personal grudge interfere with a procurement decision at a public-facing energy company, that's not just petty, that's a fiduciary problem for them. That's the kind of thing that makes a board very uncomfortable if it surfaces the right way. I'm not trying to get anyone fired. I know you're not. That's always been your problem. She said it without unkindness. You want to know if you have leverage. You do. Whether you use it is up to you. Marcus didn't sleep well that week. Not because he was afraid of losing the contract. Hale Instruments could survive losing it, painfully, but it could survive. But because something about the whole situation kept snagging on an old, familiar feeling. The sense of being punished for something he hadn't done, again, by people who had decided their own story about him was truer than his actual life. He thought about the divorce hearing, sitting silently while Denise's attorney characterized him as cold, checked out, a man who'd let his marriage die of neglect while he chased money. He'd let that story stand because contesting it would have meant explaining the hotel receipt, the pattern he'd traced, the years he'd spent quietly grieving a marriage that was already gone before he admitted it to himself. He'd let it stand because he told himself dignity mattered more than being understood. Sitting in his apartment at midnight with Sam's email still open on his laptop, he wondered, for the first time in months, whether that had been the right call. Sam came by the apartment that Friday evening, unannounced, carrying 2 coffees and a folder thick with printouts. He'd worked for Marcus long enough to read the silences that meant something was wrong, and he'd never once, in 6 years, waited to be invited before showing up with information. I pulled everything, Sam said, setting the folder on the counter. Every spec sheet, every reference call log, every certification renewal going back 3 years. If this thing gets contested, I want us holding more paper than anyone in that building. You didn't need to come out here for that. I didn't come out here for that. Sam sat down across from him, uncharacteristically direct. I came out here because in 6 years, I've never seen you lose a bid you should have won, and I've never seen you flinch when you should fight. This time you're doing both at once, and I want to know if there's something going on I should be worried about." Marcus considered how much to say. He settled in the end for a version close enough to true. "The buyer at Holding Cross has a personal reason to want us gone. I don't think it has anything to do with the quality of our bid." Sam absorbed that without asking the obvious follow-up question, which was one of the reasons Marcus trusted him with almost everything. "Then we don't fight him," Sam said. "We make it impossible for the fight to stay personal. We put it in writing, we route it through channels that don't know either of our names, and we let the paperwork do what paperwork does." It was, Marcus thought, almost exactly what Priya had told him, phrased in the language of a man who built valve systems instead of legal arguments. He didn't confront Denise. He didn't call Robert Calloway. Instead, he did what he'd always done when the world tried to make a decision about him without consulting the facts. He went to work. He asked Sam to pull together a complete record of the bid, every email, every technical specification, every reference call, every certification Hale Instruments held that competitors didn't. He asked Priya, informally, whether Texas or federal procurement guidelines required energy companies receiving certain infrastructure incentives to document the reasoning behind reopening a sole source track bid. She said yes, if Holding Cross had accepted certain state modernization credits, which a quick public records search confirmed they had. He didn't build a case to destroy Robert Calloway. He built a case to make it more expensive for Robert Calloway to be dishonest than to be fair, which was a distinction Marcus had learned. Over 15 years of contract negotiations mattered enormously in how it played out afterward. 2 weeks later, when the rebid closed, Hale Instruments' proposal arrived not just with the strongest technical specifications but with a formal, procedurally impeccable request, routed through Sam, not Marcus, so nothing would look personal, for a documented rationale behind the mid-cycle bid reopening, citing the state modernization credit reporting requirements by name. The request landed on the desk of Holding Cross's general counsel a full 9 days before it reached Robert Calloway's inbox, because Marcus had made sure it was addressed correctly through the compliance channel instead of procurement directly. By the time Robert understood what had been filed, it wasn't a favor he could quietly bury. It was already a matter of record. The call came from a number Marcus didn't recognize, a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the kitchen. "Mr. Hale, this is Elena Voss, General Counsel for Holding Cross Energy." Her voice was even, professional, the voice of someone who had already decided how this conversation would go before dialing. "I wanted to reach out directly regarding the Beaumont valve contract. There's been an internal review of the bid process." "I appreciate the call," Marcus said, and meant it, and said nothing else, because he'd learned that silence did more work than argument. "The review found the bid reopening didn't meet our documentation standards under the Modernization Credit Program. We'll be reinstating the original evaluation, which places Hale Instruments as the leading bidder. I expect a formal award notice by Friday." "Thank you. I should also mention," Elena continued, and here her tone shifted very slightly, "that Robert Calloway is no longer with the company. That's a separate personnel matter, and I won't discuss the specifics, but I wanted you to have the full picture rather than hear a partial version secondhand." Marcus sat with that for a moment. He hadn't asked for it. He hadn't wanted it. Exactly. He'd wanted the contract handled fairly, not a man's career detonated over a decision that, if he was honest with himself, had probably been made out of something closer to jealousy and insecurity than genuine malice. But he understood, too, that a man who reopened an $11 million public contract to settle a private grudge had done that to himself, long before Marcus ever filed a compliance request. "I understand," Marcus said. "I appreciate the call, Ms. Voss." He hung up and sat in his office for a long time without doing anything at all, which was unusual for him. Then he called Sam in to tell him the good news, and watched Sam's face do the thing it always did when the company won something it had earned honestly. A controlled, professional nod that didn't fully hide how much it mattered. Denise called him 4 days later. He almost didn't pick up. Robert lost his job, she said, no greeting, the way she always started conversations when she was upset, as though the preamble of politeness was a luxury she couldn't afford. I heard. Did you do that? Marcus considered the question honestly before answering it, because he owed himself an honest answer even if he didn't owe her one. I asked a company to follow its own procurement rules after they reopened a bid I'd already won fairly. What happened to him after that was between him and his employer. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. There was a long silence on the line, the kind that used to mean she was gathering herself to say something cutting, but this time, when she spoke again, her voice had lost its edge. He didn't reopen that bid because of you, she said. He did it because I told him who you were. I told him what the divorce cost you. I wanted him to see it, I think. I wanted someone to be angry on my behalf about how much you'd... She stopped. How much I'd what? I don't know anymore, Denise said, and for the first time since the papers were filed, she sounded genuinely uncertain rather than certain and wrong. I told myself a story for a long time, Marcus. That you left first emotionally. That the company mattered more to you than I did. That the marriage ended because you stopped choosing me. Marcus looked out at the parking lot again. He thought about the hotel receipt, still folded in an envelope somewhere in a box he hadn't unpacked. Evidence of a truth he decided a long time ago wasn't worth using as a weapon. I found the receipt from the Houston trip, he said quietly. The one from your sister's visit that wasn't. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it in their marriage. It wasn't defensive. It was the sound of a person finally hearing something they'd suspected the other person already knew. You never said anything, she said. I didn't want to win an argument by making you feel small. I wanted the marriage to be over cleanly, even if that meant letting you believe whatever story helped you feel okay about it. That's not kindness, Marcus. That's just quieter cruelty. You'd let me tell everyone I destroyed a marriage over your ambition, and you knew the whole time it wasn't true. He thought about that for a long moment, because it was fair, and he'd never let himself consider it might be fair before. You're right, he said. It wasn't kindness. It was pride. I didn't want to be the man standing in a courtroom explaining that his wife had an affair. I'd rather be the man who was too distant. It felt like less to lose. And the check? The check was the same thing. I didn't want you owing me anything, including the truth. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. Marcus didn't feel triumphant. He'd spent 3 weeks half expecting this conversation to feel like vindication when it finally came, and instead it just felt like grief, arriving late, for a marriage that had ended a long time before the paperwork caught up to it. I'll have the check reissued, he said finally. Not because you're owed an apology from me. Because you did work for that money too, for a long time, before either of us knew how this would end. I don't need you to be generous with me, Marcus. I'm not being generous. I'm being honest about the years you spent keeping us afloat before I could. That's not a gift. That's a debt. She didn't argue with that. She thanked him, quietly, in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone considerably younger than the woman who'd torn a check in half 3 weeks earlier, and then she hung up, and Marcus sat in his office with the late afternoon light coming through the blinds, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight for the better part of 2 years. Hale Instruments signed the Beaumont contract the following month. Sam threw a small celebration in the warehouse, the same one Marcus had leased 11 years earlier with 9 employees, and a line of credit he'd been too afraid to discuss out loud, now home to 63 people who all understood, in some fashion, that the company had been built by refusing to cut corners even when corners were cut against them. Marcus reissued the settlement check, and this time Denise deposited it. She sent him one final email afterward, not an apology exactly, more an acknowledgement, the kind two people exchange when they finally agreed on what actually happened between them, even if they'll never agree on what it meant. He didn't reply. There wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said in the silence on that phone call, in the torn check, in the compliance filing that had caused a man his job without Marcus ever raising his voice to do it. What Marcus kept, in the end, wasn't the vindication he might have wanted 3 weeks earlier, standing in that kitchen while a man in an expensive suit called him sir out of sheer surprise. What he kept was simpler than that, the understanding that the truth, held quietly and used carefully, outlasted every story anyone tried to tell about him, including, for a long time, the ones he told about himself.